Thank you for coming along this evening. This evening's talks and discussion is obviously it's part of the museum's 1936 Radical Roots series of events, but this particular event it'll be special because we have three wonderful speakers, but it's also special because it's the first collaboration between the Jewish Museum and the Wiener Library and the Pears Institute for the Study of Antisemitism, and I hope it will be the first of many such collaborations and occasions. When I was discussing by email with the other speakers what I would do, what each of us would do, I said, well, why don't I just introduce it and just give a few basic facts about Cable Street. I ought to have realised, but I now do realise, what an extremely foolish thing that was. It soon became clear to me when I called up a book in the British Library by someone called Keith Thompson, Cable Street, The Facts. It seemed promising. Until it turned out that Keith Thompson is a fascist, and in fact it was a great victory for the BUF apparently. And then talking, I'm in the coffee bar outside. We were going through what each of us would say, and I said, yes, and I'll say that 100,000 people turned up. 100,000, 300,000. So even the basic facts or some of the basic facts are not even established. What I do want to emphasise, I suppose, is the background to Cable Street, which domestically was a time of economic depression, of high unemployment, not least in the East End of London. It was a time of protest against those conditions which took politics to the street, not only through fascist politics, mostly through left-wing politics and through organisations such as the National Unemployed Workers Movement. It's also important to see, I think, what's happened in Cable Street, not just in a British context, but in a European context, in which fascists fought on the streets in Berlin, in Paris, in Madrid, and elsewhere they fought with communists and other left-wingers who opposed them. So this was part of a European phenomenon. But taking it from that sort of rather grand scale to a more local scale, what happened in Cable Street, I'll say this very briefly because I'm sure you all will know it as well or better than I do, was that Mosley wanted to march a couple of thousand black shirt supporters through the East End to a series of rallies where he would make a speech. And the first of these rallies would be in Shoreditch. And the BUF marchers wanted to set out from close by Tower Bridge. And to get to Shoreditch from Tower Bridge, they had to go through the heart of the Jewish East End, which is why hundreds of thousands massed to stop them from doing so, massed on Gardener's Corner, barring the way to the Whitechapel Road, and spread down south through Lemon Street. And the police tried to clear the protesters, and they failed to do so. A battle, or a scuffle, according to or a series of scuffles, a series of animated scuffles broke out between the police and the people who were barring the way of the protesters. And eventually, the police who were trying to clear the way so that the fascists could march, the Metropolitan Police gave in and told Mosley to call the march on. And that, in a nutshell, was the Battle of Cable Street, and it was a victory for the anti-fascists. We're very lucky to tell you more about Cable Street, and also to tell you more about how it has figured in memory since 1936, all the way up to the present. We're extremely lucky to have really three great experts on this subject. The first speaker will be David Rosenberg, the author of The Battle for the East End, which is available from all good bookstores and also from the museum bookshop outside. And David will be followed by Nadia Valman, who, together with our third speaker, Tony Kushner, edited a volume of wonderful essays on the subject, which is called Remembering Cable Street, and is published by Vallentine Mitchell.
Thanks very much. About 3 weeks ago, I was contacted by a journalist who was preparing an article on the Battle of Cable Street, and she asked for my reflections on the battle as a Jewish victory. And I think she was thrown a bit when I said that it was undoubtedly a victory and a very happy day for Jews, but not a Jewish victory. I said it was a victory instead for the united peoples of the East End. Mosley had tried to divide the East End's two largest minorities, the Irish and the Jews, against each other. But in large measure, those two impoverished communities united against him. And if they hadn't, there would have been no victory. I added that the Battle of Cable Street, as far as I saw it, was not about defending the East End as a Jewish area, but about defending it as an anti-racist space where different communities, including the Jews, could live in harmony. Mosley had credibility amongst the Irish community because of his track record on Ireland. In 1920 and 21, even when he was a Tory MP, later a Labour MP, but as a Tory, he argued for a united Ireland, for self-determination for the Irish people. He condemned the mercenaries of the Black and Tans, and it was actually over Ireland that he left the Tory party. But he maintained those positions about Ireland throughout his subsequent career. In the East End, his most avid street corner speakers often came from the local Irish community. But by October 1936, the attempt by the fascists to co-opt that community was starting to be successfully undermined by local political forces, especially through the Communist Party and the trade unions, and especially among the dockers and the railway workers. A couple of months before the Battle of Cable Street, the fascists had actually tried to hold some small meetings on the corner of Dellow Street and Cable Street, which is close to where the Jewish end of Cable Street meets the Irish end, because Cable Street was very Jewish at the end where it met the city and very Irish at the other end. And when they tried to hold these meetings there, this was a couple of months before the Battle of Cable Street, they were prevented from doing so by direct action that cut across the communities. And the people that were particularly involved in that, there was a docker called Ernie Leake, there were two local churchmen, Father Grosser and Reverend Jack Boggis, who were very involved with mobilising the local community. So, in a sense, what I'm saying is that Cable Street doesn't belong to one group of people. And that sense of Cable Street as an event that should be, and that could be and should be claimed by various communities simultaneously, was very strongly reinforced for me in recent weeks when I've had the privilege of being a member of the organising committee for Cable Street 75. And Cable Street 75 was a commemorative march which took place 8 days ago with more than 1,000 people, and it took place and it was led by banners of several Bengali community organisations from the East End, alongside Jewish banners such as the Jewish Socialist Group, the Jewish Labour Movement, followed by many trade union banners and anti-fascist bodies. Every meeting we had on the organising committee for that march had representatives from several secular, left-of-centre Bengali organisations who identified very strongly with the resistance in 1936. Now, those Bengali representatives were very, very proud of their own campaigns that they had led in the 1970s against the National Front in Brick Lane, in 1993 against Derek Beacon, who was the BNP councillor who was elected at the Isle of Dogs, but was turfed out a year later. But they repeatedly located those struggles within this longer narrative of campaigning in the East End that went back to 1936. Unfortunately, we live in times when many people prefer to see Jews and Muslims purely as enemies. But it was very refreshing that my Bengali colleagues on that Cable Street 75 committee were instrumental in translating articles I wrote about the fight against anti-Semitism in the 30s for the local Bengali papers to help mobilise for that march. And anyone who was at that march last week, which was addressed by veterans and younger activists, I'm one of those, trade union leaders, and anyone who attended the day-long Cable Street Festival at Wilton's Music Hall could not but be moved and inspired by a spirit of unity across communities and generations that was evident there, and a deep respect for the ordinary heroes who took a stand in 1936. Why then was I not that surprised to find that alongside a very positive report of that in the Jewish Chronicle last Friday, there was a feature claiming that Cable Street was actually a victory for the fascists. Yeah? So it's not just Keith Thompson who says that. Yeah? They can share that yichus with him. And it said that fascist membership and activity increased immediately afterwards, and the fascists became even more virulently anti-Semitic. And this is actually a very narrow and very static view of the balance sheet. A couple of months before Cable Street, in August 36, the speakers at street corner meetings in the East End described Jews as rats and vermin from the gutters of Whitechapel, a type of subhuman creature, simians with prehensile toes, a pestilence, a cancer. So, what could they say that could be worse? To say that it was going to get worse, it got worse because of Cable Street. And yes, the fascists did temporarily recruited hundreds of youngsters immediately afterwards who wanted a fight, who wanted some action. But they weren't ideological recruits, and they didn't stick around very long. But in the meantime, in the aftermath of the Battle of Cable Street, the fascists lost many experienced leading activists who had given years to the movement and who were immersed in that fascist ideology. But they lost faith in Mosley that day, and they lost faith in the invincibility of the movement through the humiliation that Cable Street that day. The fascists' own paper, the Black Shirt, described the day as a humiliation. And there must be at least something ironic in the fact that the fascists describe it as a humiliation and the Jewish Chronicle describes it as a victory for the fascists. I don't know, you work that out. But for weeks and months afterwards, leading members of the fascists argued with each other and many gave up. And some, like the organiser of their Shoreditch branch, Charles Wegg Prosser, who's a very interesting guy, defected to the anti-fascists. The fascist party, lost financial support from Mussolini soon after the Battle of Cable Street. Meanwhile, the anti-fascist movement had a massive injection of self-confidence, and they were able to have very big mobilisations in North and South London in the following months, and Mosley really struggled to hold his working class base. And when the fascists contested council seats in their East End heartlands in March 1937, even in their best seats, 3 out of 4 voters rejected the fascists. And in the other seats they contested, 5 out of 6 voters rejected them. It wasn't until the summer of 39, with war in the air, when the fascists had a brief revival. But it was not among the workers, it was much more among the middle and upper classes, which was where their support had started in 1932. And they were promoting themselves in 1939 as the anti-war party, seeking to prevent millions of Britons sacrificing their lives for what Mosley described as a Jewish quarrel. Now, the Jewish Chronicle probably won't want too many reminders of its own role at the time, because 2 days before the march, it published a warning to the community telling Jews to stay away, and it accused anyone who would involve themselves in confrontational activities as aiding the anti-Semites. The Board of Deputies put the same message, and they asked the rabbis to convey that message in the shuls on the Saturday before the Sunday of the march. On the letters page of that same issue of the Jewish Chronicle, 2 days before the Battle of Cable Street, the board's president, Neville Lasky, further angered the East End Jews by boasting how he had assured the Home Secretary that there was no truth at all in the often repeated claim that police in the East End were partial towards the fascists. So these individuals and institutions that I've just mentioned cannot look back with much pride to Cable Street, and they can't really claim it. Neither can some other leading figures in Anglo Jewry at the time. Neville Lasky's father, Nathan, who was a big figure in the Manchester Jewish community, and Robert Whaley Cohen, one of the leaders of the Board of Deputies and also of the United Synagogue, they consistently refused to acknowledge a link between fascism and anti-Semitism, and they discouraged Jews from taking a political stand against fascism as such. And not only that, they also praised fascist Italy as a country where they claimed Jews were prospering, and they failed to notice how many Jews were prominent in the anti-fascist opposition in Italy, or ask why that was. And in an indiscreet moment in 1936, when Robert Whaley Cohen addressed the Jewish ex-servicemen's meeting, but didn't know that a reporter was present, he admitted finding aspects of fascist ideology very attractive. One of the many documents I looked at when I was doing my research for the book was a Board of Deputies annual report from the late 1930s. Now, its intrinsic interest was actually quite low, but the back pages were very useful, because on the back pages it had the names and home addresses of all the Board of Deputies. And it was very interesting looking at that. 94% of the deputies who felt completely qualified to tell the 60,000 Jews of Stepney what they should or should not do in response to fascist threats, themselves lived outside of Stepney. 94%. And they did not share the daily experience of fascist intimidation that the Stepney Jews had. Now, what continues to really inspire me about Cable Street is Cable Street as a collective act of defiance. Defiance against the fascists, defiance against the authorities, against media pressure, against political pressure, and against such strong advice from their communal leaders. There were many, many people who were asking the Jews and other East Enders not to come out that day. But the locals were determined to act. I mean, there were 100,000 local residents in the week before the Battle of Cable Street had petitioned the Home Secretary on a petition organised by the Jewish People's Council that the march should be banned. But the Home Secretary says, in this country we have freedom of movement, freedom of speech. And just to make sure, he sent 7,000 police, including every mounted police officer in London, to attempt to clear a path for Mosley's troops. Now, David referred to this question about the estimates, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, how many were on the streets. Some of the higher estimates that I found when I was researching this actually came from police spokespersons, and they often do not play up the numbers of protesters. But even if the lower figure was accepted, even if it was 100,000, that would really be still an outstanding mobilisation. I think it would really be an exceptional turnout. Scotland Yard had their own explanation for why there were so many people there. They said, a fascist assembly was held in the East End today, and owing to it being one of the finest days of the year, many people were attracted to it, including a large number of women and children. So it was the weather. Yeah? But I remain firmly of the opinion that a bit of cloud or drizzle or even a shower might not have kept people away. But such huge numbers turning out against such countervailing pressures, it tells us something. It tells us something about the anger, frustration, and sense of abandonment by their leaders that was felt by ordinary people in the East End, especially by the Jews, who had suffered a reign of terror at the hands of the Antisemites throughout the summer of 1936. There were debates in Parliament about the reign of terror, anti-Semitic terror in the East End. And at that moment, fascism was winning in Madrid, Berlin, Vienna, Rome, and yet the people of the East End, somehow their anger was coupled with a belief that they could achieve their goals of stopping it, and they could find the allies locally who would help them. Most Cable Street veterans I have met, and unfortunately, sadly, a lot of them are no longer with us, are very diffident about their own role. But to me, they're heroes. And the actions of many of these ordinary heroes are all the more remarkable for the fact that, unlike us, they could not look back on a generation that had already waged a successful fight against fascism. They had to generate their self-belief against the odds. The determination to ensure that the fascists must be blocked must also be seen as a testament to the credibility of those who advocated militant direct action. The Workers' Circle, Jewish People's Council, Communist Party, Independent Labour Party, Labour League of Youth. I believe all those organisations do have good reason to look back with pride, not just on the achievements on the day of the Battle of Cable Street, but their consistent level of anti-fascist activity over several years in that decade, on street corner platforms, through campaigning in workplaces, and especially on housing estates, where Jewish and non-Jewish tenants were brought together in practical struggles for better lives. And for me, the unity that was forged through the Stepney Tenants Defence League, a non-political body that had 11,000 members, but relied heavily on the organisational skills and input of the Communist Party, that their work was as much a barricade against fascist encroachment of hearts and minds in the East End as the actual physical barricades on Cable Street. To finish, as well as looking back, we have to look forward. Jews may not be the front line target of the far right here today, as compared with refugees and asylum seekers, gypsies and travellers, visible black minorities, and the very diverse communities that the far right today group under the umbrella term Muslims. But anti-Semitism is not a spent force. This time last week, I was giving a talk in Leeds about Cable Street, and a Cable Street veteran was there in the audience. I was gratified that he confirmed that my account of what happened on the day and the period was true, although he said it wasn't a battle, it was more a lot of skirmishes. But I don't think the skirmish of Cable Street doesn't have the same ring to it. But he asked me the question of, will we ever be rid of anti-Semitism? And I said that I thought we would, but I did not believe that anti-Semitism could be fought on its own. And I said that the day that anti-Semitism stops breathing is the day when all manner of human hatreds and discrimination can find no way to breathe, no room to flourish. And just as we need to ensure that Cable Street can be claimed by many groups, so too we need to ensure that the fight against anti-Semitism is part of a fight against all racisms for a truly common future. Thank you.
About two aspects. One of them picking up on some of the things that Dave's said, and the other really coming from my expertise, which is as a cultural historian and a historian of literature. And I was thinking really about the contemporary resonances of the Battle of Cable Street and what it might mean to, especially to Jewish communities today. And I think that one aspect of the Battle of Cable Street that is specific to the Jewish community is the way that the impact of fascism revealed the gulf between the Anglo-Jewish leadership and the general Anglo-Jewish public, particularly in the East End, and especially the working class. And as Dave has said, famously, the leadership, especially the Jewish Chronicle, advised Jews to stay off the streets, stay out of trouble. They claimed that involvement in any kind of civil disturbance would exacerbate anti-Semitism rather than combating it. And they said, we have it all under control. This has to happen at a high-level diplomacy, and people should not take these matters into their own hands. And meanwhile, as Dave rightly said, the Jews of the East End were suffering daily harassment and violence at the hands of the BUF. And this kind of disavowal of the experience of Jews on the street not only suggests how out of touch that leadership was, I think it pushes even further to a larger question about Jewish identity itself. Did the Jews of the East and the West End really have anything in common at all? Were they more constituted by their class identity? I think we really have to ask that, because at the Battle of Cable Street, the Jews of the East End were backed not by their co-religionists, but by their co-residents, the Irish dockers, Somali sailors, the working class residents of the East End, who came out to support them and oppose the BUF, defend the streets of the East End. And I think that very graphic illustration of the fractures that divided, the contrary interest that divided Anglo Jewry in the 1930s, has some resonance for us now. The most recent sociological surveys of Anglo Jewry suggest that now there is a large body of Anglo Jewry who also feel unrepresented by the public communal leadership. There's no external threat now. There's no urgent incentive to create an alternative leadership, as happened in 1936 when the Jewish People's Council against fascism and anti-Semitism was formed as a kind of alternative counter leadership, and was responsible for much of the organising and mobilisation of the Jews of the East End on the day of the battle. But I think that now, as then, there's a fear of disloyalty, a fear of disunity, and if we want to learn lessons from the Battle of Cable Street, we can look back to that and notice how unfounded those were in the end. And notoriously, the JC, which of course had advised Jews to stay off the streets, avoid the demonstration, came out a week later with the headline, "Victory, blah blah," of Mosley. They wrote, "All dressed up and nowhere to go." They claimed and owned the victory of the Battle of Cable Street as a collective victory when it had not been won at all. So that was one point I wanted to raise, really, and also to throw it out for discussion when we have questions later. But I want to turn now to think about the cultural resonance of the Battle of Cable Street, and particularly I think its most powerful literary representation which I think is very, very compelling in itself, but it's also highly symbolic as well. And that's the representation of the Battle of Cable Street in Arnold Wesker's play Chicken Soup with Barley, first produced in 1958. And you might have seen it recently. It was just revived this year by the Royal Court Theatre, where it was originally produced. It's about an East End Jewish communist family, and it tracks their story across 3 decades, from their basement flat in the East End, in which they actually hear the battle taking place through the windows outside in the first scene, from there to social housing in post-war Hackney, from their own days of commitment, cohesion, intense activism, to the arguably more prosperous but politically bleak years following the exposure of Stalin's crimes in the Soviet Union. So the play opens with the Battle of Cable Street raging outside, and the battle is the play's imaginative centre. A day when the eternal struggle in which Jewish communists were engaged had a kind of momentary resolution. So there was a sense where that this was a very tangible victory in a long process of not very tangible victories, just a kind of movement forward without a resolution. But the battle becomes something very different in the course of the play. It becomes a kind of burdensome myth to the emerging protagonist of the play, Ronnie, who is a young man who's actually a child in 1936 at the time of the battle, too young to participate in this exhilarating victory, but he grows up with it as a kind of formative memory. By the 1950s, Ronnie is an angry young man, brought up on socialism, but no longer able to believe. In a way, it's a kind of classic story of a crisis of faith, the hero's crisis of faith. So I think here, the gigantic stature, the gigantic mythical status of the Battle of Cable Street serves as a kind of a sort of sentimentalized distraction from the here and now, from the present, from the state, the pitiable state of left-wing politics in the late 1950s, and this is obviously in the context of the suppression of uprisings in Hungary and Poland. So for Ronnie, the Battle of Cable Street represents something about the Jewish past, something that is lost over, something that can never be again. Now, I teach this play in a course that I teach about the literature of the East End to MA students, and I often ask them whether this anomie that's felt by the protagonist, the political disillusion, that sense of having been too late for glory or too late for belief perhaps, of having been brought up on an illusion that he himself can't sustain. I ask them, does that resonate with you? And I've always assumed that was Wesker's point, that we're supposed to identify with the hero, with the young man, the hero, and that the whole point of his play is to debunk the myth of Cable Street. But when I was watching the Royal Court production, I'd be very interested if other people felt this too. I felt when I was watching it this year, it's the first time I've seen it staged, having read it many, many times, I realised that the centre of the play is not Ronnie at all. It's his mother, Sarah. And Sarah Khan is a kind of embodiment of the Jewish East End. She's a nurturer and a supporter of activists. She's always making sandwiches and tea, but also on the streets herself. She's an activist who never loses faith. At the end of the play, in this extremely heart-wrenching scene, she is denounced by her son for being stupid, for kind of sublime stupidity, for her refusal to ask questions about what communism has actually become. He berates her for this kind of blind faith and her denial of everything that is now contradicting it. But it was my sense that the Royal Court production was asking the audience not to identify with that adolescent young man who brutally blames his mother and turns his back on her entire generation and their battles. It wanted us to listen to Sarah herself, to her integrity, to her idealism, and above all, to her yearning to make the world better. All my life, I worked with a party that meant glory and freedom and brotherhood, she says. You want me to give it up now? You want me to move to Hendon and forget who I am? As we well know, of course, moving to Hendon for Wesker is synonymous with abandoning the ideals that animated a generation, pursuing individual prosperity rather than the universal ideal of brotherhood. But in the Royal Court's production, this wasn't even in Wesker's mind, I think, quite probably. That universal ideal has not ceased to be relevant, but it is an ideal. It's seen as an ideal, something to be yearned after in a kind of messianic way. And I was just fascinated that the Royal Court, and clearly the audiences who flocked to this, it was a sold-out production, found this extremely compelling, found this message very compelling. I think the Battle of Cable Street is important for our time because it provides an example of Jews understanding their Jewish identity in this wider context. Catholics and atheists flocked to the East End that day to defend Jews from being intimidated in their own streets. But at the same time, Jews linked the fight for their streets to something bigger than themselves, to the larger context of the struggle against fascism in Spain, Germany, and Italy. Oh, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Kerry, and everyone at the museum for putting on these series of events, including tonight's. About 12, 13 years ago, I embarked on a sort of obsessive Cable Street research enterprise, looking at the memory of Cable Street from the day right through to then the late 20th century. And I think this is ongoing. Dave referred to the events in the East End over the last 10 days or so. We've had all sorts of media things, including something I thought I'd never ever see in my life, which was Nadia on the One Show. So I'm looking forward to presenting sort of unusual vegetables, shapes like British fascists in the next few weeks. But I read through my obsessive essay in this Remembering Cable Street piece, and did refer very briefly to the Jewish Museum and its many sort of complex roots over the last 20, 30 years, and how Cable Street, Battle of Cable Street, had been quite prominent in its very, very early days at the Museum of the Jewish East End. And then it seemed to be sort of slipping away. But this is sort of bringing it back home very, very, very clearly. So I'm very, very pleased that's happening. But I think we are sort of part of a process that's ongoing. It's clear, if it's on the One Show and other things, that it still has a resonance in the 21st century. And what I'm going to do is look at some of the mythologies. And this is not to debunk them and say that it's all nonsense. Because there is something remarkable about the day and also how it's been remembered. And it was brought home to me this morning. I received a package of photographs from someone who was James Parks' gardener in his late life. Now, James Parks may be known to a few of you, but not many, perhaps now. I work at the Parks Institute at the University of Southampton. And Parks was a Christian clergyman, a radical Christian, very much in a radical socialist tradition of post-1918 Anglicans. And he devoted his life from the 1920s onwards to fighting anti-Semitism and fighting fascism. He, almost by accident, discovered anti-Semitism on the continent of Europe, working for the Christian students' movement and the European students' movement. And that's where it was at its most virulent in the 1920s, on the campuses of Central and Eastern Europe. And Parks was very active around Cable Street. He was a member of the Jewish People's Council, which Nadia referred to, though he was a Christian. And it just struck me of this sort of curious thing when I opened these photographs, and this was with Parks in his late in life, looking like he was just out of a 1960s sitcom on sort of, I can't remember the sitcom on Vickers in Britain, but looking so lovely.
I'm all gas engaged.
Very good, David. Very good. Someone you need on a pub quiz. With dog collar in the garden, and it was just so hard to imagine this figure being active in debates in East End of how should you confront Mosley. And here was someone born on Guernsey, Oxford educated, but with the people, as were other clergymen, and David Rosenberg referred to Father John Grosser, and there were others as part of that movement. So it is a remarkable day, and that you can't, however much you demystify it, it's still there. But the myth, I think, is very powerful, and I want to quote one of the successors, if you like, to Grosser and Parkes, Kenneth Leach, who was very, very active as an Anglican in the East End from the early post-war period until very recently. And he says the Battle of Cable Street is a myth in the strict sense of the term, an event of imaginative power, a source of inspiration, a symbolic conflict with which those involved in subsequent struggles could identify. On another level, as Leach adds, the power of this mythology has led to blatant distortions and even falsehoods, including that the battle destroyed fascism and Mosleyism in the East End, that it occurred in the heart of the Jewish East End, that it was masterminded by the Communist Party, and finally, most widely misconceived, he says that it considered the struggle between fascists and anti-fascists. And I'll give you one example, which is not to make fun of this, although it is remarkable in its way, but because on one level, almost everything I'm going to read from this autobiography is factually wrong, but on another level, it is the essence of the day. So very hard if you're teaching students, is you read something like this, but don't actually reproduce the so-called facts. And it's from someone called Joe Morgan, who was born in Canning Town in East End. In his own words, one of the labour movement's most active irritants of the 1970s. I shouldn't say this, but I'm being very indiscreet. But we were trying to get something through at Southampton, and my line manager said, and I said, well, we've just got to go to a committee. He said, oh, you're so 1970s. Right, well, I wait the sandwiches and tea from there. But here it is, Joe Morgan. Mosley announced that he was going to march through the East End. The communists and Cockney dockers were determined to stop him. There were running battles and barricades at places like Cable Street, but my part in all this, 10 years old, was to be a runner. The black shirts intended to drive into Canning Town in lorries. The men of Canning Town were waiting as a human barrier. I was waiting on Canning Town Bridge, my goal being to run to the Beckton Arms pub with the news of the impending fascist invasion. The lorries were sighted. When it was my turn to pass on the message, I set off as fast as I could, shouting, "The black shirts are coming." I had done my duty. The lorries turned up and the black shirts spilled out. The communists and dockers sat upon them immediately. As if from nowhere, a horde of policemen descended on the battle, trying to defend the black shirts. Truncheons were used left, right and centre to cosh those opposed to Mosley. The man himself travelled in a car, his whip in hand, but it was Mosley who was whipped, his face scarred for life by someone in the crowd who struck him as he tried to get out of the car. Eventually the black shirts had had enough. Even the police could not save them. Oswald Mosley never came to the East End again. So, almost wrong. But in terms of the essence of the day, and that's where I think that mythology is so important in itself, and it's not to debunk it. But I want to look at two aspects, and the first of which is the role of the Communist Party. And this is not, again, to diminish it, because it's clearly very, very substantial and important. And it's perhaps, as Dave says, more important in terms of grassroots activities like tenants' defence leagues and the like, which continued afterwards and through the war and beyond. But it's in terms of the writing of the history and the very terminology of the Battle of Cable Street, and all of the terminology linked to it was very much a military struggle. So it can't be the squabble of Cable Street or the handbags at dawn at Cable Street. It has to be the Battle of Cable Street. And it is very much the Communist Party fighting a war that has begun in Spain, and then will have very little place to go, which is why, if you trace the history of the Battle of Cable Street from roughly 1938 through till the late stage of the Second World War, it disappears from memory because it's the communists who are promoting it most. And communists, it will not fit communist mythology, especially following the defeat in Spain and then the brief communist-Nazi pact. It doesn't work anymore as a sort of as working history. But what the domination of the communist historiography, mythology of Cable Street has done to a large extent until the last 20 or so years was wipe out other forms of activism, and particularly Jewish activism. Jewish People's Council has been mentioned several times. David also mentioned the Workers' Circle, and other radical groups, and sometimes not so radical groups. The East End was divided itself. Some Jewish Labourites were very, very active in it. Anarchist groups, even some left-wing Zionist groups as well were very active at that time. But they've been largely written out of the picture. It also, and the second point out of this, is it ignores the somewhat cynical opportunism of the Communist Party at that point in the summer of 1936. Initially, the big rally was going to be in Trafalgar Square, and it was going to be about Spain. And it took the activism of Jewish communists and non-communists, Jewish activists, to push, to demand the opposition to the fascist march. So it was not clear until a week or so before of where the communists were going to put their attention. So it shifted from Trafalgar Square through to Gardner Corner, but quite late in the day. And again, it took quite recent memoirs and rewritings of history from a more Jewish perspective to write that more into the equation, as well as those who were not necessarily political, who were just ordinary people who were active at the time, Jewish and non-Jewish. But I think there's a sort of wider issue here of how, particularly in the left liberal world, how do political groups and political parties treat minority groups? Because these issues have not gone away. On the one hand, you could argue, particularly on the far left, there's been a constant anti-fascism and anti-racism, and that shouldn't be denied, and it's very, 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 very important. But also we've seen, as multiculturalism has gone away from being a rather fluffy concept that everyone can embrace, of the 3 S's of samosas, steel bands and saris, to something that is actually rather tough and hard to confront. That with the Rushdie affair from the late 1980s onwards, the left liberal world has been shown to be a rather curious ally of some minority groups, ethnic, religious, and others. So I think it raises some interesting issues of politics and minority groups. And we've seen that also, perhaps one of the most infamous and horrific issues of racial violence, the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993, and a very, very clear tactics by his parents to avoid being part of a sort of socialist worker party bandwagon, which may be an unfair way of putting it, but which had happened in previous racial murders, particularly in South London, and to try and attract what they saw as Middle Britain, the Daily Mail. And it's perhaps that made that murder part of public consciousness, whereas all the others had really made very, very limited impact, very sadly so. So I think there are interesting issues outside the celebration of Cable Street in terms of politics. And then the second issue is about Cable Street and multiculturalism. I want to read from one of the, I think, perhaps most prominent of the witnesses, eloquent and frequent commentators, Charlie Goodman, which I think summarises very neatly that's another form of the mythology. Charlie Goodman, who's one of a young person at the time, I think a teenager, recalled seeing Catholic dockers, the sons of Irish immigrants, Orthodox Jews wearing long silk coats, Somali seamen and local Cockneys joining to drive the hated black shirts off the street of the East End. And that has proved a very, very sort of durable and usable mythology of the East End uniting over perhaps what was the most significant divide of Irish Catholic and East End Jews, but also over colour, which is something that we see as a post-war issue, but was very much part of, certainly, of Cable Street, which wasn't just Irish and Catholic, but was also the heart of the very, very diverse sailor town area of London. Now, so this idea of everyone united is certainly not made up, but it also is in danger of being a very romanticised version. It's certainly there in an incredible mural to Cable Street, which reflects both past and present. But it also is that there are positives and negatives with this. It's what I want to sort of close with. Is on the negative side, that mythology can ignore some of the tensions that existed between those groups, some of the hostility between Jews and Catholics, which was profound in the 19th century, and right really through to relatively recent times. Read the Catholic press, read the Jewish press, and there's a mutual antagonism there, which I think is rather close to that which you might read in the mainstream press today in terms of Jewish-Muslim relations. There will be rather sad but quite profound theses to be written in the future about Jewish attitudes to Islam, read through the pages of the Jewish Chronicle over the last 20, 30 years. And we mustn't disguise those hostilities, just as we mustn't romanticise relations, say, between Africans and Afro-Caribbeans, and all sorts of other groups, as well as those within the groups, which Nadia has mentioned beforehand. And yet, and this is where I want to close, and this is again where I fit into my own mythology, or promote my own mythology, one thing that I think you can read from Cable Street is there are times where, in spite of people's differences and perhaps antagonisms, that people can unite in spite of them. And I think ultimately that is what happened at Cable Street. However much there was antagonism, there was an even greater antagonism to the foreign presence of the British Union of Fascists.
Thank you very much to all three of our speakers. We now have a good half hour for questions and discussion. So if you raise your hand, I'll try to pick you out. And if you can speak up when you ask your question, that would be great. Yes.
Yes, I'd like to ask each of your panelists, if you could, to comment on both the interpretation and the evidentiary basis for the interpretations of David Cesarani's student, whose name I fear
Daniel Stillers?
Yes, right, Stillers, precisely.
Can any of you perhaps summarize what his conclusions are, so that those who don't know them, or can you do so for us?
I heard Cesarani present Tillis's views at the St. George's Hall a couple of Sundays ago. Mm-hmm. Essentially, the argument is, and this is at third hand, so don't believe a word I say, but more cooperation between the Jewish People's Council and the Board of Deputies that has thought more proactive work on the part of the Board of Deputies and Lasky than has been thought. battle gave much needed publicity to Mosley and the BUF, and encouraged more demonstrations, and the Board of Deputies was having detectives infiltrate the BUF and got the entire membership list of the BUF, and waited until the fall of France to give it to the Home Office, but I suppose better than never. And in general, then, it was the lesson for Cable Street is that we should obey our elected officials.
So the Board of Deputies has been much maligned by David and Nadia. Would you like to?
You have the info.
The article I was referring to in the Jewish Chronicle last week that was saying that Cable Street was a victory for fascism was by Daniel Tillies.
It was by.
Yeah. It was, and I said that I felt it was a very narrow and static view of the balance sheet around it. But beyond that, I mean, I would like to say a little bit more about the Jewish People's Council and the Board of Deputies, because I've read other articles that that Tillies has written, and he says in some of those articles he acknowledges that up to 1936 the Board of Deputies was very complacent and very out of touch, but in the period 36 to 39 it did play a more proactive role, and there was in the end some degree of cooperation with the Jewish People's Council. People from the Jewish People's Council who have told me their version of the history don't see it quite that way. I've got actually, it's quite an interesting photocopy of a leaflet they did in 37 or 38 called the Jewish People's Council and the Board of Deputies. And I'm very happy if people want to look at that a little bit later. But in essence, the biggest dispute between them was that the Jewish People's Council believed that anti-Semitism in the 1930s was different to anti-Semitism at previous stages in British history, because it wasn't just an antagonism against the Jews. Anti-Semitism in the 1930s was being used as a weapon of fascism, that it was a rallying cry against the Jews, but it was also the way that the fascists wanted to build their organisation. They needed anti-Semitism to build their fascist organisation, and therefore any confrontation with it had to tackle both those things together, anti-Semitism and fascism. Also, the Jewish People's Council said that the board tended to sort of see anti-Semitism as a Jewish issue and could be resolved by the Jews themselves, whereas the Jewish People's Council was saying that fascism was a threat to everyone in the society. Everyone that believed in democracy and benefited from democracy was under threat from fascism. And that the People's Council argued that non-Jews had an interest in fighting anti-Semitism and Jews had an interest in fighting fascism. You know, they weren't sort of separate things for them. And there were private meetings that went on to try and resolve those differences. And the Jewish People's Council offered on at least 2 occasions, possibly more, to submit itself to the authority of the Board of Deputies campaign if anti-fascism was part of that campaign. But the Board of Deputies wouldn't budge on that. They didn't want a campaign that was specifically targeting fascism as well as anti-Semitism.
If I could sort of add to David Rosenberg's analysis there, that it wasn't until fascist Italy went officially anti-Semitic in 1938 that the Board of Deputies then thought it was okay to attack fascism, because then fascism could as a whole be regarded as anti-Semitic. And it's a tortured logic, but the logic of the Board of Deputies must not get involved with party politics. And it was getting itself in a terrible mess. But I suppose one sort of footnote or caveat is that both the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Chronicle were not monolithic. So there are different voices in the Jewish Chronicle. There are communists who are writing for it, or those that are sympathetic. So those who've been very, very... And the same, I think, is true within the Board of Deputies. It has a dominant voice. They both have dominant voices, but there are alternatives. So in the Jewish Chronicle, it makes it easier post 4th of October to come out to say it was a great victory, because there are those within it who had already seen that was the way it should be presented. And so the board was getting more active in infiltrating fascist groups, liaising with the state in a way that the Jewish People's Council couldn't do. You could argue that the Board of Deputies was far too close to the state at that point. So there are some, I think what Daniel Stillis is trying to do is nuance it, but obviously he's got to try and make a bigger space for himself. Whether you go short-term or long-term in terms of membership, I think longer-term it was a humiliation for the British Union fascists. But if you want to go short-term, and it's not his argument, Richard Thurlow and others have argued this as well, that there was a raise in membership. But that's true of other far-right groups. And then, but if you look a year later, then it's a different story.
Could I just add one more short thing on that?
Very
short. No, just to say that a month after Cable Street, the Jewish People's Council organised a conference to build on that success and to build on the fight against anti-Semitism and against fascism, and invited all kinds of bodies, including the Board of Deputies, to that conference. Not only did the board not come to the conference, but they organised their own separate meeting that day, which Neville Lasky, the board president, was addressing, and they wrote to other Jewish organisations saying, don't go to the Jewish People's Council conference, come to this one. So, yeah.
I'll just abuse my position and add one other thing. that I think what was at stake here was actually not only, as Tony says, a question of whether you engage with fascism or not, but it was also a fundamental disagreement over what caused anti-Semitism. And as far as the Jewish leadership was concerned, and the leadership of all the political parties, including the upper echelons of the Communist Party, they thought that Jews caused anti-Semitism. And that's why they thought that Jews ought to keep a low profile. And one of the, I think, extraordinary things about Cable Street, which hasn't been mentioned yet, which is why I'll mention it, is that, if you like, it was a mass demonstration of people who, in effect, were refuting that view of where anti-Semitism came from. And I think it's important, not least for that. There was a question.
Yeah. I think that it's easy to talk about the Communist Party as somehow some separate other from the events and from history, but the communists were totally enmeshed in the area. I think it worries me that you talk about it as a list of something separate. I think it's not my own family. My grandfather lived at 111 Cable Street on the corner of Christian Street, which is partly where it is near where the barricades were, and were active. They met at a Young Communist League dance. Young people, if they wanted to meet other people, went to the YCL dance, much more likely, as likely as at a synagogue or anything else. And when it comes to, again, to the Workers' Circle and to the Jewish People's Council, it was communist branches of the Workers' Circle, because the Workers' Circle was divided into different political groups and controlled different branches. It was communist branches of the Workers' Circle that founded the Jewish People's Council. It's really hard to talk about these organisations as being separate, because the communists very heavily influenced the Workers' Circle, very heavily influenced the Jewish People's Council. That's not to say that it was a front organisation, because obviously it wasn't. It was very broad. And it's easy to talk about the fascists and the election results of the fascists in 1937. But we've got to remember that Phil Karatin, who was, came to prominence during the Battle of Cable Street, that period, he was elected as a communist MP. Communists were very heavily supported. When it came to the end of the Second World War, you had a dozen communist councillors, and you had a communist MP. And in the end, not just the Battle of Cable Street, but the role of the Red Army. These are things that had a massive impact on the Jewish people. In the end, by 45, I think it's irrefutable that the Communist Party had hegemony in the East End. Most Jews, whether they were members or not, they understood and supported, or at least recognised the existence and the actual just on-the-ground fact of the Communist Party. And certainly in the case of my family, who were either in or not in the party, it was an immovable and irrefutable fact. of its strength.
Thank you. I wonder if it might be an idea if we gather a few questions and comments, which will allow some more people to speak than if 3 people respond to it. Yes, sir.
Unless I misheard you, I think you were intimating that the Irish turnout, which was one of the largest turnouts at Cable Street, wasn't so much due to helping the Jews who lived in Cable Street as well, the Cohens and the Kellys, but for their own reasons. But this seems to be forgetting the folk memory of Irish dockers who in 1912, when they went on strike, and there were very little union funds to help their family, their Jewish neighbours looked after them, fed them, and looked after 300 Irish dockers' children. This stayed with them, and I'm sure this helped the reason why they went out to Cable Street. Furthermore, there was enmity, but people certainly never stepped over the unwritten barriers between different areas where you were no-go areas. But generally, I think there was a much more cohesive behaviour between the Irish dockers and the Jewish community than you're tending to tell us about.
I would like to ask something about the response of the mainstream press and the media to this event, particularly Times, the Telegraph, Daily Mail. It'd be interesting to know how they reacted.
Shall we take those 3? Do you want to start, David?
No. Right. Okay. No. Yeah. I mean, so actually, the point about the Irish and the Jews, because you get many different accounts of this, and I think part of it depends on where people were living within the East End, because there was certainly some sections of the East End where those communities were very distant from each other and were willing to believe lots of stereotypes about each other. But when you talk to the Jews who grew up on those areas that were much more on the cusp of the Jewish and the Irish areas, they talk about their best friends being the Irish as much as the Jews. You know, there were sort of genuine close friendships between young people that were and families there that were very, very real. And that's not just from 1 or 2 people, that's from several people that has come from. There was still quite a lot of segregation in the workplace, which was a hangover from when the Jews came as immigrants. They were working for Yiddish-speaking employers. And so, although both Jews and Irish were very involved with the clothing trade, they very often were working in different workplaces. I want to come to the point that was made about the Communist Party, and I think it is very important to recognise, to treat the Communist Party and the Jews as separate rather than overlapping categories would certainly be wrong. There were branches of the Communist Party in the East End that were mainly Jewish, and there's something which I took with me yesterday when I was doing a walk of the East End, which I was showing some people there. In my family, my mum's cousin's husband, Monty, from about 20 years ago, every time we met at a Simply, he said to me, "David, I've got something for you, but I've forgotten it. I'll bring it next time." And this went on at Simples every few years until it was my dad's funeral about 10 years ago. And as we shook hands, me and Monty, there was something between our hands. And it was his Young Communist League badge from the 1930s, you know. And he later in life became quite apolitical, but he still looked back on that period as the most brilliant period of his life. And he talked about it. When he talked about it, he talked about his Jewish life and his communist life. They were completely intermeshed. The Communist Party was actually relatively small in the country. In 1936, the Communist Party had 11,000 members nationally. In the East End, it had several hundred members. It had around 550 members in 36 and a Young Communist League of about 250. But its paper, the Daily Worker, was read in several thousand in that area. So that thing about the kind of hegemony in the area, I think, is a very significant one. the response of the mainstream press, a lot of, from my memory, when I was looking at the research around, when I was doing the research around this, a lot of the press did it in terms of law and order, that we mustn't allow this kind of thing to happen on our streets where people are being violent with each other, where there is such disorder. They reported some of the court cases that arose out of it. It should be noted that on the day of Cable Street, there were 84 arrests. 79 of them were anti-fascists. 5 of them were fascists. Yeah. But that's my sense of it. That most of the mainstream press really sort of saw it in those terms. At an earlier stage in '34, the Daily Mail was much more strongly identified as a supporter of Mosley, and anything that was attacking Mosley, the Daily Mail would very much defend Mosley. There was more distance between them and Mosley by that time.
I'd just like to respond on the question of the Irish and the Jews in a slightly different vein to Dave's, although I find his interpretation quite compelling also. But I think I'm struck in reading memoirs by how much people talk about Jews and Irish going in and out of each other's houses all the time. Nonetheless, it's true that what was said at pulpits and in the press did not suggest that. And I think it's a very good example of how the sort of evidence that you get from testimony and a memoir actually makes the picture somewhat more complex. So looking at the kind of official discourse in printed sources or in the sorts of things that were officially said doesn't actually tell us the whole story. And in some ways maybe Cable Street demonstrates that most clearly, most evidently.
Just briefly on Communist Party, I think we've got to some extent separate the leadership of the Communist Party from grassroots, and that there may be a sort of greater empathy towards the Communist Party as the party that seemed to be most clearly anti-fascist and clearly opposed to politicised anti-Semitism. But the communist leadership, to say that it, cynical, manipulative, I think would be, it's just, I don't think you have to be a Daily Mail reader of the 1930s. This is not a democratic party. This is not a responsive party. This is a party that's controlled by Moscow. So its reading of what it's going to do from above, and that's the tragedy of the Communist Party in this area, in some ways, because there was enormous empathy and sympathy towards the cause, which is what Wesker writes about afterwards, that disillusionment and the refusal to let go and the refusal to acknowledge what had happened in the Soviet Union. We also, I'm sounding really cynical, so-and-so, but never mind. Yes, the East End resisted Mosley, but the East End also reached out to Mosley. What happened in 1935 was as much the East End, or small sections of it, significant, but small sections of the East End, went looking to Mosley, and there were Irish and others involved with that. So it was very much a grassroots East End movement as well. It wasn't significant enough to win the day, but it was still there, and we can't ignore that fact. Just as there's a tradition, usually on the edges of minority communities, Bethnal Greens and so on, not at this point at the heart of immigrant areas, but very much on the far reaches of them. And I think we can see that parallel today in the limited success the British National Party had, not in high immigrant areas, but areas where people feared invasions, and so-called invasions. In terms of the press, I think there's a parallel here with the recent riots. It's interesting how the One Show tried to sort of say that these riots in 1936, they were purposeful riots, not like these recent things. It certainly was not how it was seen in 1936. But there was the same thing that was sort of people going in, not having a clue. You get lots of journalists sort of going into the East End as an adventure, as they've been doing since the 19th century. But there's a revival of that. But in the law courts, in the hierarchy of the police, right through, as David says, you have this incredible meeting with Harry Pollitt, Herbert Morrison, and several others. So Communist Party, Labour Party, trade unions, Jewish, all saying the same thing, that it's the radical Jews, the criminal Jews, that are causing a lot of the problems.
And the spivs.
And the spivs, yes. And a differentiation between the good assimilated Jews and those nasty, horrid Jews who are foreign, criminal, and radical. And that's a discourse that's been very, very powerful in the media. And it certainly continues. There are major exceptions. Manchester Guardian, New Statesman, you'll get a very different picture, very much more sympathetic towards the real problems that the Jewish population are suffering on a day-to-day level, and why there is so much sense of isolation and need for support.
Can you tell me, is it an exaggeration to think that the Mosley's resurgent anti-fascist and anti-Semitic movement after the war was finally destroyed by the exclusively Jewish 43 group? And did they hark back to Cable Street?
Could you repeat the question, please?
The question is whether fascism was ultimately destroyed after the war, and what was the role in that of the Jewish 43 group. Yes.
I hope I'm not trivialising it at all, but I was in the East End. I lived in the East End in Bow. I was 8 in 1936, so you can work out how old I am. And my mother was 1 of 9, and she had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. They all lived in or around the East End, and her brothers were all engaged in the amusement catering business, and they had catering arcades, and they had one in the Haymarket, but they had one in Mile End Road. And so the arcade was on the ground floor, and 2 floors above was living accommodation where my grandmother lived, my bubba lived. And every weekend, the whole family went there. But the point about this arcade was that when you were sitting in the front of the house, you looked directly down Stepney Green. Now, I happened to be with my bubba on that day. I think I must have known, I'm not sure whether I knew what was going to happen, that the Mosley was marching. But I was there, and I was sitting looking down Stepney Green. And my mother had one brother called Harry. But one of her sisters had married a man called Harry, so we had to distinguish between the two. And the way we distinguished was that the brother-in-law was fat, and he was called Fat Harry. And he was fat, and he was a big man. He was a tailor, but he was the mildest man you can imagine. You could never have an argument with him because he would never confront you. He would always, accept and whatever you said. So that was the type of man he was. And I was sitting in the front room, looking down Stepney Green. And then gradually, people started coming into Stepney Green, a crowd came into Stepney Green, and were almost filling it up. And my guess is that they weren't sure of which way Mosley might what march, or it may be that they wanted to keep back some people and just introduce them at the last minute. But this crowd grew, and I looked down at the crowd, and I could see at the very far end Fat Harry, and he was brandishing a stick. And he was the most innocent man you could meet. And the numbers grew, and then suddenly they got a command, obviously got a command, to move off, go down towards Commercial Road. So they about turned, and leading the crowd was Fat Harry, brandishing his stick. And that's my recollection of it.
Can I just ask about the legacy of Cable Street for young Jews? Because I fear we're not going to get it. They don't have it. And what can we do so that this is part of what young Jews grow up with?
Yes.
This is related to what Edie just asked in a way, and to pick up a point that Nadia said about the extent to which so many Jewish people feel unrepresented by their leadership, and talked about all three of you really talked about the fractures in the community. It was really striking at the Cable Street 75 events last weekend, the extent to which people were stressing unity and the extent to which people were really identifying as anti-fascists and defenders of democracy and defenders of communities across communities, and that were being quite explicit really in recognising the fractures within their own communities and making alliances between progressive people, if you like, say secular Bengalis with secular progressive Jews, as opposed to unholy alliances between fundamentalists of different communities, which are not only not progressive but are often quite fascistic. And it's really difficult for people to stand up and say, I think it was you, Nadia, that said it's really, really hard for people to stand up against the mainstream of their community and to be overtly at odds with a very powerful portrayal of their community by a particular group within that community, such as the Board of Deputies or the Jewish Chronicle or whoever's doing that. But it seems to me that the struggle against fascism and the struggle against very oppressive, racist and fascistic forces it gives people an opportunity to do that and to, I think, forge a new kind of identity in which they can both be assertive about their own ethnicity, but also assertive about making strong connections with other people who are organising either along communal lines or trade union lines or political lines or whatever it is.
Thank you. Who'd like to respond to any of that?
Could I just respond to Julie and to Edie? I think I was struck by going to the commemorative march how few young Jews there were, and it saddens me that the message in the terms that we've inherited it doesn't seem to be going across, and there doesn't seem to be an inheritance of the kind of struggle that we've talked about here in the current young generation, moving though it is for people of my age and older, I think. Nonetheless, the night before that march, there was a party organised by an anarchist group called Judas, which some of you may have heard of, which explicitly sets itself up as a kind of counter-communal organisation. That was attended by about 300 people, young people. So I think that if the message isn't going across in terms of joining demonstrations, going to marches, going to rallies and hearing political speeches by an array of trades unionists and cross-communal organisations, nonetheless that heritage is being taken up in a different way. And I think that I'm quite heartened by that, there are ways in which, new forms of using that memory in resistant ways.
I'll just pick up 2 points, one about the 43 group just after the war and one about the young Jews. the 43 group, just after the war, even before the end of the war, there were demobbed soldiers who were appearing on platforms in Hyde Park, at Speaker's Corner, before the end of the war, spouting fascist politics. And after the war, there were sort of small groups and societies and book groups that started to organise and then be a bit more bold and go on the streets. And Mosley was keeping in the background quite a lot at first, but then at a certain time he came much more to the forefront again. And it was a kind of militant direct action organisation, the 43 group, that tried to disrupt every meeting they had, where their sole aim, if a fascist meeting was happening on a street corner or in a park, their sole aim would be to go there and turn the platform over and disrupt the meeting and then go away. What they had on their side at that time, more than the people in the 30s, was the police response was different. The police response to the 43 group was quite a bit more sympathetic than the police response to the anti-fascists of the 1930s, and I think that partly made a difference. It wasn't an exclusively Jewish organisation. It was largely Jewish, but not exclusively. On the young Jews question, well, two things that I do, and maybe there's some other things that other people do around this. Yesterday, I did a walk for the Jewish Museum, which was an intergenerational walk around the Battle of Cable Street, which went from Aldgate to the Cable Street mural. And in the Cable Street mural, you've got this fabulous educational tool, actually. And there were very young children and sort of much older people and people of generations in between on that walk yesterday. And I've done workshops in schools around the Battle of Cable Street and taken school groups on walks there. But it's much easier to get the East End schools, largely composed of Bengali children and Somali children, to come there and be very receptive to that history than it is to get the Jewish schools. I have occasionally managed to get some Jewish schools to come to the East End, but it's quite difficult. And one group that I did take, within 10 minutes, they wanted to sit down and eat and not walk.
But they were a Jewish group.
Just to add on the 43 group, I think it's a very different set of people. That it's, again, generational. These are often people just out of the army, or maybe just didn't quite get into the army, and that they are very, very angry. But the reference point of the 43 group in terms of its propaganda is very much the Second World War, Holocaust, Belsen especially, and just absolute fury that these people should be out in the streets again. It's a very angry movement, it's a very macho movement in its way, it's a very violent movement. It's also, although there are communists, it's incredible broad church, from Zionist revisionists through to communists. But it makes very little reference to the 43, to Battle of Cable Street, because I think they're using a different reference point, and it is the Second World War and what we've now called the Holocaust. On the youth issue, I think we have a dominant, we were talking about this before we came in, a sort of dominant image of what, again, crudely put, the Jewish establishment in this country presents the problem of, say, students and youth is, the problem is from the left, the liberal world. And it is, okay, we don't sympathise with the right, but the problem is the left liberal world. It's the Guardian, it's the BBC, and whatever. And that's where the emphasis is. It doesn't necessarily correspond to what people's actual experiences are, but it means that that's not part of where the community officially is situating itself. And to change that, I think we do need to try, whenever, I think the experience of all of us here, that when we teach around the Battle of Cable Street to a younger generation who've got no knowledge of it at all, and for my students, most of them are not Jewish, they're fascinated by it, they're inspired by it. And so it's not that it's redundant, that it's yesterday's news, it's irrelevant, it's packaged in the past. It does resonate for them, but it's just getting it out there. And there are enormous amount of resources, and that there are plays that were written by people like Chris Searle and others, with community groups in the East End, with Bengali kids, fantastic work which engaged generation that came from a different part of the world 50 years, 60 years later. So it's not the event itself that it is redundant. It's getting it into everyday use. And I think if we have a general overview, we should present ourselves as victims today, as we are doing, but of coming from a totally different perspective. It's not surprising that the 20th century's sort of greatest threat to the Jews from Nazism and fascism, there isn't much space for it. If our friends actually turn out to be our enemies, as has been presented by the mainstream Jewish world. I know that's a rather polemical way of putting it, but I think that's squeezing out a radical history.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. It's a very fine note, I think, for us to end on. We are out of time, I'm afraid, but I'd like to thank you all for turning up, and especially thank you to those who asked questions or who made other sorts of interventions, but especially thanks to our three splendid speakers this evening. Thank you very much.